Welcome back to the Deep Dive. For our UPSC aspirants and history buffs, today's deep dive is part 2 of our exploration of modern Indian history.
We're zeroing in on 19th century India,
When British rule had a huge impact on Muslim communities.
especially those elites who felt a real shift in power.
Our goal today, to unpack those key Muslim reform movements.
Who were the players? What were their ideas? Why did they matter? And what was the impact?
From embracing Western education to advocating for a return to pure Islam.
It's going to be a fascinating journey.
Exactly. And for those of you gearing up for those UPSC exams,
Oh, absolutely.
understanding these socio-political dynamics.
Oh, crucial.
It's key EY for tackling those GS1 modern history questions.
You've got it.
Okay, so let's jump into the 19th century. And one figure who really stands out is Sir Syed Ahmad Khan.
Sir Syed, a fascinating figure,
He's known for promoting Western education among Muslims.
but there's so much more to him than that.
So much more.
He wasn't just saying, hey, everyone, go learn Western stuff. He was trying to find a way to make it work with Islamic thought.
He saw the value in both.
He believed in this underlying oneness of all religions, arguing for a kind of practical morality
Really?
that transcended religious boundaries.
So he wasn't about, like, converting anyone.
No, not at all. He even emphasized the similarities between Hindus and Muslims.
A unifying force.
It was a very forward-thinking approach.
So he saw Western ideas and institutions gaining influence, and he wanted to prepare Muslims to thrive.
Exactly. To bridge that gap, he did incredible things, translated English works into Urdu.
Oh, smart, making them accessible to way more people.
He founded the Scientific Society, spreading those modern ideas.
Amazing.
Started an English-Urdu periodical.
Wow. Just fostering intellectual exchange.
He was all about connection.
His biggest legacy, though, has got to be the Mohammedan Oriental College,
Oh, absolutely.
which later became the Aligarh Muslim University,
That's right.
a physical manifestation of his vision.
Exactly. A place for Muslims to receive a modern education within an Islamic framework.
It really set a new era in motion for Muslim education and thought.
Definitely.
But it wasn't the only era response to the challenges of the 19th century.
No, far from it. We also have the Deoband movement, and they had a very different take.
The Deoband movement, so if Sir Syed was about engaging with the West,
Right.
it seems like the Deobandis were more about strengthening traditional Islamic scholarship.
And religious identity, you're spot on.
They felt Western influence was a threat
They did.
to their values and traditions.
They felt the best way to preserve their faith and culture was to double down on the fundamentals.
Like going back to the source.
Exactly. The Sharia, Islamic law,
Right.
and the tariqah, the path of religious knowledge.
It wasn't about fitting into the modern world. It was about creating a space where traditional Islamic learning could thrive.
A world within a world.
Their own network of schools and madrasas.
Yes. Emphasizing Islamic jurisprudence, theology, and Sufism.
Sufism. Now that's interesting because they were strict about Islamic law,
Right.
but Sufism is about this deeper spiritual connection with God.
It's that mystical dimension of Islam.
So they saw it as a way to kind of push back against the British.
Absolutely. The tariqah, the Sufi path.
Provided that spiritual framework to resist secular influence.
That's right.
So, to recap,
Okay.
Aligarh focused on blending Islamic thought with modern education.
Mm-hmm.
Deoband was all about returning to those roots.
Of Islamic scholarship and spirituality?
This tension between tradition and modernity,
Oh, classic.
it just pops up everywhere in Indian history.
You see it again and again.
And speaking of tradition and modernity,
Oh, here we go.
we have to talk about the Wahabi movement.
This is where things get interesting.
Things get a little revolutionary.
You could say that.
Active resistance to
Yeah.
British rule, right?
Led by Syed Ahmed Barelvi.
Syed Ahmed Barelvi.
The Wahhabis, they believed Islam had become corrupted.
Corrupted how?
Practices and beliefs that strayed from the true path.
Straying from the path.
They wanted to purify the faith.
Purify it.
Get back to those original teachings of the Prophet Muhammad.
And they believed that establishing an Islamic state
Based on Sharia law.
was the way to do it. So they weren't afraid to use force
No.
to reach those goals.
They resisted British rule,
Tapped into that anti-colonial sentiment.
which was brewing across India.
They saw the British as oppressors.
Exploiting India, undermining its people, and their faith.
And even though their resistance didn't work out in the end,
Right.
it shows how strongly some Muslims felt
Oh, absolutely.
about the injustices of British rule.
It reminds us that not all Indians just passively accepted British rule.
It was a struggle.
And it shows how closely religion and politics were tied together.
These movements weren't just about religious doctrine.
Oh, no.
We're talking power, identity resistance.
Finding a way to be Muslim in a world that was changing so rapidly.
Under British colonialism.
It was a defining era.
That's why it's so important to understand these movements.
Especially for our UPSC folks out there.
They provide a glimpse into the complex social and political landscape of 19th century India.
And help us grasp the forces that shape the country.
Okay, so we've covered Aligarh, Deoband, the Wahhabis.
3 big ones.
But there are other important movements we need to discuss.
Oh, yes.
We'll dive into those in our next segment.
So we've been talking about these Muslim reform movements in 19th century India.
And how they weren't just about religious doctrine.
It was so much more than that.
They were about politics, identity, education.
Economics even.
And for our listeners, prepping for the UPSC.
Right.
Understanding this interconnectedness.
Oh, absolutely.
It's crucial.
Yeah.
It's not enough to just know when each movement happened and what they were called.
You've got to dig deeper.
You've got to understand WHY and how.
Exactly.
Like, for example, how did these movements address that tension?
Between tradition and modernity.
That we keep coming back to.
A perfect example is the Ahmadiyya movement.
The Ahmadiyya movement. Now, this one is interesting.
Very interesting.
Because their founder, Mirza Ghulam Ahmad,
Mm-hmm.
claimed to be the promised Messiah.
A bold statement.
Especially in the context of traditional Islam.
It caused a lot of controversy, even persecution.
Wow.
But what's fascinating about them is their emphasis on a peaceful, universal message of Islam.
Really?
They rejected violence
Okay.
and jihad.
As ways to spread the faith.
Instead, they focused on dialogue
Interfaith dialogue.
and understanding.
So a lot of these movements were focused on asserting a distinct Islamic identity.
Right.
Almost in reaction to British rule.
Mm-hmm.
But the Ahmadiyya movement,
They were different.
they were trying to bridge that gap.
Between Islam and other religions.
They saw Islam as a universal religion that could embrace everyone.
That's right.
So it challenged those more orthodox interpretations.
Yeah, were common at the time.
Okay, so to recap,
Okay.
Aligarh movement promoting Western education within an Islamic framework.
Mm-hmm.
Deoband movement emphasizing traditional scholarship and Sufism. Ahmadiyya movement advocating for a more inclusive and universal vision of Islam.
3 very different approaches.
And that diversity.
It reflects the complexity of Indian society at the time.
India in the 19th century was just this
Cauldron of change.
politically.
Socially,
well,
the very fabric of Indian society was being transformed.
by British rule.
And these movements were a reflection of that.
And it wasn't just about reacting to British rule.
Right.
Some of these movements were interacting with each other,
Mm-hmm.
challenging each other.
Criticizing each other's approaches.
Like the Arar movement.
Yeah, they emerged in the early 20th century.
As a critique of the Aligarh movement.
They thought the Aligarh movement was too focused on elites
Okay.
and their education
And not doing enough to address those broader concerns.
of the Muslim community.
So the Arar movement, they were more political.
More politically oriented, yes.
They aligned with the nationalist movement,
The growing nationalist movement.
advocating for self-rule.
They wanted Muslims to be at the forefront of the fight against British colonialism.
Okay.
So their challenge to Aligarh.
It shows that even within these movements,
Mm-hmm.
there were disagreements about how to deal with the British.
Absolutely.
It wasn't one single response.
No.
So we've got these different approaches to British rule,
Right.
internal debates within the movement.
Yeah.
And then we also have movements focused on specific social and economic issues.
Like the Faraidzi movement in Bengal
The Faraidis, led by Haji Shariatullah,
and his son Dudu Mian.
they were all about strictly following Islamic practices.
Mm-hmm.
But they were also concerned about those peasants being exploited.
By the British indigo planters.
They saw that as an economic A&D, a moral issue.
Absolutely.
So they combined religious piety with social activism.
Right.
It reminds us that these movements,
Weren't just theoretical debates.
they were about real problems
And trying to build a better future.
for their communities.
That's why they're still relevant today.
They dealt with questions of identity, faith, power, resistance.
Questions that are still with us in the 21st century.
You know, as we go through all these different movements,
Yeah.
I'm struck by how they reflect this broader theme
of modernization versus tradition.
that we see all over Indian history.
It's this push and pull
Between holding on to the past and embracing the future.
It's a constant tension.
And it's especially intense during times of rapid change.
Like 19th century India.
Everything was changing.
All those old certainties were gone.
New ideas everywhere.
And people are trying to figure out how to make sense of it all.
These movements.
They're a testament to that struggle.
And for our UPSC aspirants out there.
Yes.
Understanding this tension between tradition and modernity.
So important.
It's crucial for analyzing these movements.
Ask yourselves, how did each movement deal with this tension?
What were the disagreements and conflicts within each movement?
And how did these movements shape the bigger picture in India?
Because history isn't just a list of dates and events.
It's a story.
About people.
Their hopes, their fears, their struggles.
And by studying these movements,
We're not just learning about the past.
we're gaining insights into the human condition.
Exactly.
We're getting a glimpse into the minds and hearts of people who are asking some of the biggest questions of their time.
Their struggles, their successes, their failures.
They offer us valuable lessons today
As we navigate our own complex world.
of identity, faith, and nationhood.
In this ever-changing world.
All right, welcome back to the deep dive. So far, we've explored the who, what, and why of these 19th century Muslim reform movements in India. But now, in this final part, we're shifting gears a bit to talk about their lasting impact.
Impact, yeah, that's a big one.
How did these movements shape the future of Indian Muslim society?
And how did they contribute to those events?
That eventually led to the partition of India.
It's a big question.
Huge question.
And one historians are still debating. But it's
Yeah.
remember,
Yeah.
this was a period of massive change.
Upheaval.
British colonialism was transforming India in really profound ways.
Absolutely.
And these movements were all part of this larger process.
Of change and adaptation.
It's not a simple story of cause and effect.
Right. As we've discussed,
Yeah.
these movements weren't monolithic, right?
No, not at all.
They had different visions
Diverse visions.
for how Indian Muslims should navigate this new reality.
Some, like Aligarh,
Aligarh, yeah.
advocated for engaging with the West.
Western education, Western institutions.
Others, like Deoband,
Deoband.
they emphasized traditional Islamic learning.
And a stricter interpretation of religion.
And then you have groups like the Wahabis,
The Wahhabis.
who believed armed resistance was the only way forward.
So remembering this diversity of thought and action,
That's key.
it's zero.
When we try to understand the legacy of these movements,
Right. It wasn't just one movement shaping the future.
there's the interplay,
Between all these different perspectives.
the debates,
The fault lines they exposed within Indian Muslim society.
and those fault lines.
They became even more pronounced as we moved into the 20th century.
Absolutely, with the rise of Indian nationalism.
And that demand for independence
These movements sort of foreshadowed those debates.
that would later dominate Indian politics.
Yeah, questions of identity,
Representation.
religious versus secular governance,
It's all connected.
it all intertwined.
So for those prepping for the UPSC,
This is important.
it's not just about memorizing names and dates.
You've got to connect it.
You've got to understand how these movements fit into the bigger picture of Indian history.
Exactly.
How did they influence Muslim political thought?
How did they shape relationships between Hindus and Muslims?
Leading up to partition.
These are the questions.
The questions that separate
Those who just know the facts.
from those who really understand history.
It's about analysis.
Okay, so let's look at some examples.
Okay.
The Aligarh movement, with its focus on modern education.
And a more liberal interpretation of Islam.
They played a big role in the formation of the Muslim League.
One of those key political parties that pushed for a separate Muslim state.
But it's not that simple.
It's never that simple.
The Deoband movement, remember?
With its focus on tradition,
religious conservatism.
preserving Islamic identity.
They had a huge impact too.
Yeah, contributing to other Islamic political parties.
And fueling those debates about the role of Islam.
In a future independent India.
And even movements like the Wahhabis.
Who ultimately failed in their armed resistance.
Right. But their ideas...
They inspired future revolutionaries.
They added fuel to the fire of that anti-colonial sentiment.
The sentiment that eventually led to India's independence.
This is complex.
It's really complicated.
The legacy of these movements is multifaceted.
They provided the framework for so many political and social movements in the 20th century.
It's all connected.
And while we can't draw a straight line from these movements to partition, it's clear that they contributed to the climate.
The intellectual and political climate?
That made partition a possibility.
They raised questions about identity.
Belonging?
The role of religion in public life.
Questions that are still debated in India today.
It's a reminder that history isn't just about the past.
It's about understanding the present.
By studying these movements,
we get a deeper understanding
of those forces that shapes the world we live in today.
They offer insights into identity, faith, nationhood.
In a diverse society like India.
They teach us that history is not just facts and figures.
It's a living story.
Woven from the hopes, dreams, struggles, and triumphs of real people.
And by engaging with that history,
we gain a deeper understanding of those forces
that have shaped our world
and continue to influence our lives today.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into 19th century Muslim reform movements in India,
I want to leave our listeners with a question to think about.
How do these movements inform our understanding of India in the 21st century?
The challenges, the opportunities.
It's a question worth pondering.
And for those preparing for the UPSC, remember, connecting these historical movements to contemporary issues is key.
It'll not only make you a better historian,
but it'll also give you those analytical skills.
You need to ace that exam.
Exactly.
Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive.
We'll see you next time.
Don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives into fascinating historical topics.